I'm Joel. I'm a co-founder of Ceramic Network, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the learnings I've had through the last kind of 5-6 years as I've been working on kind of identity and user-centric data, and really how we can work together as the Web3 community to outcompete kind of the big Web2 companies that are really kind of destroying the information ecology right today. So imagine you're building a Web2 application, and you want to make that kind of feature-rich. You want to make it interactive for users, and maybe they have like comments and they can follow each other and stuff. You need to basically store a bunch of data about the users. And so the way you do that in the kind of traditional Web2 sense is that you create something called a user table. And a user table is this really simple database that lives on your backend, where each user has like an identifier. You might store a password hash so you can authenticate the user, and some other information like username and whatnot. And so this is great. This allows the application to grow and like gather network effects by onboarding more users. But there's of course a problem that most of us probably know about, and that's each user, or sorry, each application kind of build their own silo of data, and they build their own network effects. It's like separate from each other. And as that game kind of plays out in the Web3 world, we end up with something like this, where there's a bunch of huge companies that have like huge user tables with a bunch of data about their users, and they're really starting to just extract as much value from the users as possible. And that's really hurting the users in various ways. But we really want to build something that's more like this, kind of more like a solar punk vision of users controlling their data. It's being openly accessible by each application, and these kind of modular, so we can like move around and put different data pieces together. So let's look at like how dApps are doing today, because with Ethereum, aren't we really able to do this already? Well, most dApps that have more feature-rich applications with user interaction and stuff like that still have a backend today. They have their own separate user table, and we still have the silos. So smart contracts are fully kind of public and shareable, and that's really what we want, but that only kind of right now works for financial stuff. And while you still authenticate with the user's wallet, the data kind of still gets locked into the different applications, and we still get these silos. So we need to do something better. We need like a shared global user table that we all in Web3 can collaborate on and work together to create shared kind of network effects. And so we could imagine like a simple way to do this, basically just like having an Ethereum address and associating some data with it, like a username and whatever we store in there. But there are some problems with this, and I'm going to go through some of them, because this is like a very simplistic approach to this. So one thing is, if you just use like an Ethereum address as like an identifier of a user, then you run into trouble if you might want to interact in a governance forum, and you have some of your you have a day-to-day wallet, and you have a hardware wallet where you keep kind of your assets, but you don't want to like every time you interact in the governance forum use your hardware wallet and like authenticate that. So you kind of want to put those two addresses together into one kind of account. And you might also have different accounts and different wallets on like Ethereum mainnet, on layer 2s, maybe on like different blockchains. And now if you have like this global user table, but it's siloed in like Ethereum and then maybe Polkadot and other things, you end up with these silos anyway. And now it's not big companies that have the big silos, it's the different blockchain platforms that become silos. So we need to really create this user table needs to have a unified identity where we can pull all of the different accounts that you have across different blockchains and layer 2s into one kind of account. Another important aspect is we need to make this user data that's stored in the table antifragile. And what that means is essentially if you have app A and app B, and they both have a column in the table that's a name, now app 1 might create a name that's just a string. And app 2 might have an object that a name and a surname has two different properties. And now if users from application A go to application B, they might break their front end, and vice versa if they go the other way. Like the apps might break if they're expecting different types of data. So that's something we need to deal with. Another thing, if you think about the kind of traditional Web 2 world, you might have, if you're building an app that relies on Facebook data and uses the Facebook API, you're kind of reliant on that data, that Facebook keeps that like data around and the API open. And if they remove that, your app is kind of screwed. But in the Web3 ecosystem, we can actually have the data live on a kind of sovereign network where like you have censorship resistance. So even if the application you're pulling data in from and relying on disappears, that data, you can expect that data to keep being around. And so that's an important aspect as well for this kind of system. And finally, once we have this global shared user table, we can start creating shared network effects. And so what that means is essentially, if I create my application and I create some nice data model that describes the data I'm storing in the table, and I onboard like 10,000 users. Now that's great for me, but then there comes another application that creates, basically sees the data I've created and finds it useful. Now that application can bootstrap their app with my 10,000 users, and maybe it's super successful, so they onboard like another 100,000 users to use the same data model. Now I benefit from that because now I have access to another 100K users, and we can kind of share network effects. And once that starts growing enough, we can actually start competing with these larger data silos, and they're going to have to like compete on the same level as we, because we have this kind of collaborative approach. And this is kind of like, I think, really how we as a Web3 community can start to compete with these big Web2 big tech companies. Right, and so with the Ceramic Network, we've been working on this type of problem for a while, and we've created a framework to store data in this way called self-ID. So self-ID is really kind of like you can think of it, you can like think about it as a user table. And here we have an ID and we have a bunch of columns. So the ID is something called a DID, a decentralized identifier. And it's really like an agnostic way of representing a cryptographic identifier. And so that could be, as you see on the top, an Ethereum address, the PKH, or that can be any blockchain address. Or you can have an NFT where the current owner is the one that's allowed to update data. We've also created an NFT method called 3ID, which essentially allows you to take your accounts on different blockchains and layer 2s and pull those into one kind of unified identifier. And then you can see the columns here. We have names in the first column. The second column is like some random metadata property of the user. And in column 3, we have some encrypted data. So we see that we can have both kind of public and private encrypted data that's stored with the user. And each data is defined by a data model. And the data model has a unique identifier. As you can see, like in the header of each column here. And so data models are created by developers. And the reason we want a unique identifier is that we don't want that kind of competition where I talked about before with a name being, so if you have a column for a name, that people expect different types of data in there. So here you can actually use a data model to remove that kind of anti-fragility. All right, so who actually then controls the data that's in this table? Is it the developers that created the data model, or how does it work? So I think it's important for this kind of large repository of user data to actually work and actually be not fall into some kind of system where application developers still can silo part of their data, that the users actually control of their whole row. So the users' keys can sign updates to each cell here. So here this user can update its name, it can update this metadata property, it can update its private data, and the user is also the one who decides which applications can write to these columns and which applications can read the encrypted data. And this really allows us to have a shared system where no application can kind of claim control over the data. And if we look into what a data model is, it's really kind of some metadata information like name and description, maybe something else about a particular column in the table. And it also includes a data schema. This data schema is really important for us to build this kind of composable data ecosystem, because it basically specifies what the data inside of the cell looks like. And if someone tries to put some other type of data that's not compatible with the schema, that will not be valid, that won't work. So now that actually solves the problem we were talking about before with kind of the fragility of people writing different forms of data. If I'm a developer, I see data model 2 seems super useful, then I know what the schema of the data I can always expect when I'm like retrieving and writing the data there. And so with this kind of self-ID framework, we can really start building a user data commons that we can share all across Web3. It's not locked into any blockchain ecosystem. It's not locked into any application. And I think this has some really interesting effects on how application developers and projects can provide value to users and how they can't provide kind of extract value from users. So if you think about the large companies of today, like Facebook and Google, they really use their repositories of data to just extract as much value from the users as possible and really use the data to manipulate the users to stay longer, to buy more stuff. And we've seen kind of some of the drawbacks of that being that like it can create polarization if you have these news feeds that are algorithmically controlled, but the optimization function is actually just driving profits for the company. But if we have this shared user data commons, that you don't have that problem, because if I'm as a user was using an application that's really extractive and like manipulates my data, I have an incentive to just move to another application because the data is not locked into the platform of that application. It's just globally available on this shared table. And so I can go to another application that doesn't kind of extract and manipulate me. And so instead of having algorithms that optimize for the benefit of some corporation, we can have algorithms that optimize for the values that are aligned with a particular community you're in, or optimize for yourself, or yeah, basically like groups of people that you care about. All right, so if you're interested in learning more, and you can check out Self-ID, which is where you can create your row in this user table and start kind of building out your identity. If you want to build stuff and help kind of unsiloing all of humanity's data, you can go to our blog or our documentation at ceramic.network. All right, thank you everyone.